pump prices. And as fans wait for Spider-Man's comeback in local cinemas, a new poster reveals a returning foe. The Health Department is expected to submit to the Interagency Task Force later this week its final recommendation on the face shield mandate, but it appears some local governments could no longer wait for that and have issued an order lifting the rule in crowded and enclosed places. Later this
Saka
week,
alam
its
naman natin
final
ang Pangulo natin
recommendation
ay
on
may
the
edad
face
na at
shield
meron na
mandate,
ring
but it
mga
appears some
karamdaman
local
na related sa kanyang age. And alam niyo, tinitingnan ko yung mga comments ng mga articles regarding that. Even yung kanyang mga supporters, ang
At 63 years old, Nora Laksamana is having difficulty seeing clearly whenever she wears a face shield. That's why she welcomes the Manila local government's decision to scrap the face shield mandate in public areas except in healthcare facilities.
Ngayong normal na ang ipinatutupad dahil sa banta ng COVID-19 at ayon sa isang medical anthropologist, ilan sa mga nakagawian ng mga Pilipino ang dapat nang baguhin upang makaiwas na
o kaya naman pupunta ka sa
mahawa
center.
sa sakit.
Kasi
Alamin
usually
natin
ang
kung
health
ano-ano ang
center
mga yan sa report ni Aiko
No,
Miguel.
or even public utility
Nakagawian na ng ilang mga Pilipino ang dumura kung saan-saan, lalo na sa mga pampublikong mga lugar. Ayon sa isang medical anthropologist na si Dr. Michael Tan, kailangan ng iwasan o tuluyang wag nang gawin pa ito ng mga tinatawag na duralista. Ito'y dahil paraan ang mga nakagawian ng ilan para kumalat ang virus, lalo na ngayon na laganap ang COVID-19.
We urge all local governments to just hold their executive orders or their issuances so that we can all be uniform in our implementation and we are all aligned.
Health Undersecretary Rosario Vergere reiterates face shield is an added layer of protection against COVID-19.
There are evidence to state na ang COVID-19 makapenetrate din yung eyes natin at pwede tayong ma-infection.
Ayon pa kay Dr. Tan, mawawalang silbi ang physical distancing kung careless naman ang ilan na bumahing ng napakalakas nang hindi nagtatakip ng ilong at bibig.
COVID-19 Task Force spokesperson clarifies establishments may still require clients to wear face shield.
Pero mga establishment pa rin tayo that they
we have to explain to them, grabe yung achieve mo, baka kulang yung 1 meter na physical distancing sa pag-achieve minsan ng mga ibang kalalakihan natin.
Dapat din anyang maipatupad ng mga LGU ang mga ordinansang nagbabawal ng dumura gaya sa Manila City upang makatulong sa pagpigil ng pagkalat ng COVID-19. Payo pa ni Dr. Tan, hanggat walang bakuna sa COVID-19, ipagbawal muna ang mga marathon karaoke o videoke session na nakahiligan na ng mga Pilipino, maging ang liquor ban o pagbabawal sa pag-iinuman. Hanggat maaari ay wag muna sanang bawiin ng LGU. Ang mga ganitong aktibidad anya ay makakadagdag sa bilis ng pagkalat ng COVID-19 sa bansa.
Vergere says the DOH and health experts are considering recommending the use of goggles and double face masks in lieu of face shields. She adds goggles also protect the eyes from droplets and aerosols. While the City of Manila is adamant on its new policy, Malacanang says face shields are still required in crowded areas, closed spaces, and close contact settings.
Point po siya for being in violation of an existing executive policy decreed by the President himself, in the exercise of police powers. Aking pakiusap po sa mga local government units natin, sa ating mga mayor, lahat po ng mayor ay under po the control and supervision of the President in the executive branch of government. At ang decision naman po ng IATF ay decision din ng ating Presidente. So ang decision po ngayon ay kinakailangan ipatupad muna ang face shields habang pinag-aaralan naman po. Konting pasensya lang po, pero kinakailangan sundin po naman natin yung chain of command sa executive branch of government.
Interior Undersecretary Jonathan Malaya revealed to CNN Philippines some members of the IATF have raised the idea of conforming face shield use to the vaccination rate and alert level system in an area amid pleas to get rid of face shields. But Malaya says this is among the proposals being ironed out. From one policy to another, authorities are eyeing requiring vaccination among poor families with the continuing threat of COVID-19 and its variants. The Interior Department bears plans to withhold the subsidy of non-vaccinated beneficiaries of the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, or 4Ps. While some say the policy is anti-poor, the agency points out only 12% of the grantees are vaccinated. George Giles has the details.
The government targets to vaccinate half of the country's eligible population before the year ends. Based on the Health Department's data, about 4 out of 10 eligible Filipinos are already fully vaccinated as of November 2. Among the regions, Metro Manila has registered the highest vaccination rate, with at least 8 out of 10 eligible population are vaccinated. But it's a totally different story in the Bangsamoro region, where only 1 out of 10 eligible population is inoculated. Bangsamoro Health Minister Bash Latif says, aside from vaccine hesitancy, cultural concerns and lack of inoculators, logistics and storage issues in isolated areas, and local conflicts affect their vaccination drive.
Yung hesitant, nag-engage po natin yung mga religious sector, yung mga ulama, imam, para tumulong po sa atin.
One measure that is being proposed is a withholding of a portion of government subsidy for non-vaccinated beneficiaries of Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, or 4Ps. Interior Undersecretary Jonathan Malaya says only 12% of the beneficiaries are vaccinated based on the Social Welfare Department's data. They are now looking at withholding the 750 pesos per month health and nutrition subsidy until the beneficiary gets vaccinated.
So this is not just a DILG proposal. This is actually a result of the clamor of our local government units for a help from the DILG to have some sort of disincentive on the part of 4Ps beneficiaries.
Bukas po tayo dyan, pero kailangan pag-aralang maigi kasi we do not want to violate also any rights of a specific individual in terms of receiving their benefits coming from government.
The Bangsamoro Health Minister is hopeful that the Interior Department's proposal will materialize. Based on 2020 DSWD data, the Bangsamoro region has the most number of 4Ps beneficiaries at 376,000 families.
Ang tinitingnan natin dito yung kapakanan ng mga kababayan natin na para at least wala pa tayong nakikitang konkretong ebidensya na may gamot talaga sa COVID. Kung hindi ang ating panangga ngayon ay ang vaccine.
Hindi po tayo makakalagpas dito sa pandemyang ito hanggang hindi po lahat ay napapakunahan. Kung meron po tayo na meron tayong hesitancy na more or less 34%, napakalaking sizable amount po yun, 34 million ang nag-roam around na parang time bomb.
Malaya says the government will look into the legal issues concerning the no vaccine, no subsidy proposal before implementing it. George Cahiles, CNN Philippines.
Meanwhile, in Cebu City, only vaccinated government employees will receive their Christmas bonus. Acting Mayor Michael Rama explains the incentive is different from the 13th month pay, which means the local government has the discretion whether or not to grant it. Rama believes this will help boost their inoculation drive, which is only around 40% complete. Cebu City has so far vaccinated 290,000 people out of its over 700,000 target. Now, the country reported its first case of the Kappa variant, but the patient was long tagged as recovered. Health Undersecretary Maria Rosario Vergere says the patient was a local case from Florida Blanca, Pampanga, whose sample was taken back in June 2. She says the man only exhibited mild symptoms during the time of sample collection. Kappa was named a variant of interest. But in September, the World Health Organization downgraded it into a variant under monitoring. Vergere says the variant emerged from the same lineage as the Delta variant and is most commonly found in India. The case was detected late because the government is sequencing older samples to trace the source of the Delta variant. The Health Department also reported over 651 more cases of the Delta variant from over 700 samples taken in March, April, May, June, September, and October. Coming up, expect cheaper pump prices with fuel companies set to cut costs beginning tomorrow. And we look back at some stories of survivors from the deadly super typhoon Yolanda 8 years ago. Details next, only here on Newsnight, where we go above and beyond the headlines.
Love is all about time. Di minamadali ang pagpapasarap. Like the love in every Pure Foods ready to eat. Slow cooked and ready in 8 minutes. Para may time ka sa mga mahal mo. Because love takes time.
For my babies, only vet-approved Nutri-Chunks puppies. The only one with active boost and prebiotics na pampalisto. Made with
So it's a very welcome amenity that families enjoy. Plus the fact that we have the swimming pool open for the kids to enjoy, plus the restaurants also.
The nearby Linden Suites in Ortigas is also preparing for more guests, especially the children. Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve bookings are selling hot as early as now.
Actually, yung mga pumasok na queries and reservations are families. And we know naman that this Q4, especially we are approaching towards Christmas season.
According to the Tourism Department's Alert Level 2 guidelines, those under 18 years old may already go for staycations regardless of vaccination status. Unvaccinated adults, as well as those over 18 with incomplete doses, however, still require a negative RT-PCR swab test. Children are now also allowed to eat inside hotel dine-in establishments. Hotel dine-in capacities for indoor venues are set at 50% for fully vaccinated adults and all children, while outdoor dining is set at 70% capacity. Both hotels in Ortigas also laid out their own rules. Only 6 people are allowed to use the swimming pool per hour to ensure physical distancing. Hotel staffers in both staycation and mixed-use hotels should be fully vaccinated. Mixed-use hotels, meanwhile, should ensure that quarantine guests are separate.
Welcome back to Newsnight, where we go above and beyond the headlines. It is 8 years since Super Typhoon Yolanda devastated Leyte province. As Tristan Odalo tells us, the trauma still lingers for many survivors.
In the early morning of November 8, 2013, Super Typhoon Yolanda unleashed its wrath in Tacloban City and nearby towns in Leyte and eastern Samar, destroying almost everything in its path. Survivor Ann Codera and her children took refuge in a building in Palo, Leyte, praying for their safety as Yolanda devastated the area.
Parang nakabangon naman na physically, pero siguro emotionally, nandoon pa rin yun.
Another survivor, Edwin Ezor, says 8 years after the tragic day, the painful memories brought by the super typhoon remain.
Kabuhayan po namin na natira, yung mga bahay po namin, at saka maraming mga nawalan ng mahal sa buhay. Marami din mga naggutom. Sobrang hirap po na hanggang ngayon pag naiisip po namin, naiiyak pa rin po kami.
Survivors mark the 8th anniversary of one of the world's most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded that took about 6,300 lives with solemn rites. From the Shipwreck Memorial in Anibong District in Tacloban to early morning masses in Palo Cathedral and Tanawan, Leyte. Environmental groups also staged protests demanding climate justice to prevent another Yolanda from happening. For UP Resilience Institute Executive Director Mahar Lagmay, the Yolanda experience significantly reshaped the country's disaster readiness and response.
We have improved considerably. Much improved yung ating mga response, much improved ang ating awareness against disasters, natural hazards.
An interagency task force is currently fast-tracking the government's rehabilitation projects for areas affected by Super Typhoon Yolanda. 8 years later, the government has yet to finish its target housing units for thousands of Yolanda survivors.
So far, the government has turned over 148,000 housing units to survivors out of its 204,000 intended beneficiaries. The National Housing Authority reports that over 20,000 housing units are also expected to be turned over this December and in June 2022. Based on the final report of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, Yolanda, internationally known as Haiyan, has directly affected over 16 million individuals and destroyed properties amounting to 89 billion pesos. Tristan Odalo, CNN Philippines.
A bit of relief for motorists as oil firms roll back gasoline prices after 10 consecutive hikes. Beginning tomorrow, Petron, Caltex, Clean Fuel, Flying V, Phoenix Petroleum, PTT Philippines, Sea Oil, Total, and UD Oil will slash gas prices by 1 peso per liter. The same fuel companies will also cut diesel prices by 60 centavos a liter. Petron, Caltex, Flying V, and Sea Oil will also lower kerosene prices by 65 centavos a liter. Diesel and kerosene also went down by a few centavos last week. The president and CEO of Petron, an oil company previously owned by the government, says he is willing to sell the company back. Ramon Ang said in a House committee hearing on the price monitoring of fuel products and proposals to suspend excise tax on fuel that the government could buy Petron back at market valuation over a 5-year period. Ang notes Petron lost 18 billion pesos last year, refuting claims that it is a lucrative business.
Isa pa rin para mas mapababa isa nga rin sa suggestion ng Makabayan Black ay makuha ulit itong Petron Corporation at ma-nationalize ito para mas makita po natin at makapagsilbi po sa mamamayan natin ng mas mababang Petron sa quality na sinasabi po ng ating ni RSA na kung paano nila inaano yung kanilang overhead.
Yung sinasuggest na bilhin ng gobyerno yung Petron privatization, anytime po pwede ko pa ipautang sa Philippine government, bilhin niyo ito ng over 5 years to pay. Ano ho yan? I swear, kung gusto ng gobyerno bilhin, handaan nyo na, sabihin nyo na. At bebenta ko kagad sa inyo. Market valuation lang, hindi ko kailangan tubuan ng gobyerno.
Bayan Muna Party List Representative Carlos Zarate filed a bill returning Petron to government ownership under House Bill 244. The Philippine National Oil Company will acquire 51% of Petron stocks within the first year of the proposed law. PNOC will obtain full ownership of Petron after 4 years. The country is not spared from human trafficking, more specifically child trafficking. Even parents exploit their own children in desperate need of money. In this special report, AC Nichols look into cases of this modern-day slavery and how the pandemic even worsened the situation.
Wala po ang kakayanan na magsumbong kasi nga po bawal naman po ako lumabas at binubugbog niya po ako physically. Natatakot po ako kasi nga po at the age of 12 parang hindi ko po kayang lumaban.
College student Cassie, not her real name, recalls painful memories from a decade ago. As a young girl of 12 to 16 years, she was sold into the cyber sex trade by a man she only knew as a neighbor's relative.
Sabi niya, papaaralin niya ako, bibigyan niya ako, at yung family ko na magandang buhay, kinabukasan.
Authorities receive reports of hundreds of similar cases yearly. A United Nations Children's Fund or UNICEF study in 2016 said the Philippines has emerged as a center of child sex abuse material production. UNICEF says English literacy, availability and access to technology, and established money transfer apps are some factors that contributed to this concern. For the past 5 years, the Social Welfare Department has rescued over 2,000 children from trafficking, mostly young women aged 13 to 17. Many of them were exploited by people they were close to, like relatives and sometimes even their own parents. The DSWD believes the pandemic worsens the problem. For one, children are spending more time at home. Meantime, unemployment skyrocketed.
Madami yung nawalan ng trabaho, madami yung walang pinagkakakitaan ngayon. So yung poverty ang main driver natin.
Quarantine restrictions have also made it more difficult for authorities to carry out rescue operations.
So even if we get reports from the local government units, ang hirap na pasukin, lalong-lalo na kung ang isang area is nasa ECQ. So ang dami namin pinagdadaanan na proseso.
Overwhelmed with cries for help, civil society group Voice of the Free set up a quarantine area so it can continue accepting victims. Aside from providing shelter to victims, the group works with the education department to raise awareness in poor communities, areas they consider to be possible hotspots for cyber sex trafficking of children.
Ang daming mga kaso, hindi naman alam ng mga bata kung saan sila pupunta eh. Saan sila hihingi ng tulong.
Voice of the Free believes preventing this crime is so important. The trauma can take years of therapy to heal.
Hindi nila alam kung saan na nakakalat yung kanilang mga picture, kung kanino na shinare, kung i-judge ba sila ng community, i-accept pa ba sila ng mga friends nila. So, it's really stripped their dignity as a person.
The group also works with the Justice Department to help victims go after their pimps and former customers, mostly from Europe and the US. For the DOJ, its efforts face technology and manpower challenges. While criminals use popular sites like Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok, they also go deep into the dark web or sites that are only accessible via specialized web browsers.
Itong mga offenders, advanced lagi eh. They're like 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps ahead. So we have the technology now. And then by next year, iba na naman yung technology yung gagamitin nila or even just a few months. Grabe mag-evolve yung technology. So, yun, naiipit na naman tayo doon.
Another challenge, getting the victims to go after their own family members.
Yung attachment nila at love doon sa perpetrator. Kasi minsan nagkakaroon sila ng feeling of guilt na sila yung magkukos ng kapahamakan nitong perpetrator na ito.
Just last year, a regional trial court in Angeles City sentenced an American national to life imprisonment for forcing children into cybersex shows. As for Cassie, justice has been served as well, with her pimp also behind bars for life. Now, she spends most of her time earning a college degree and helping other victims rise up and see the bright side.
Huwag sila mawalan ng pag-asa kasi maraming taong naniniwala sa kanila and maraming taong tutulong. Hindi ka nag-iisa.
AC Nichols, CNN Philippines.
In news overseas, Japan records no new COVID-19 deaths on Sunday, the first time since August 2nd last year. That's according to state public broadcaster NHK. A government panel is coming up with a new 5-stage scale for assessing the country's COVID-19 situation as its vaccine rollout further progresses. The United States reopens its doors to fully vaccinated foreign travelers. The U.S. lifted a travel ban on international visitors from over 30 countries that took effect nearly 2 years ago. However, visitors still need to show proof of vaccination and a recent negative COVID-19 test, with some exceptions. Still ahead on Newsnight, the San Miguel Beermen bid goodbye to their all-star forward in a surprising trade, and Marvel drops another preview of the latest Spider-Man film, giving fans a first look at the return of a familiar foe. Details after a quick break. Welcome back to CNN Philippines. In the United States, a lawsuit has been filed against organizers of the Astro World Music Festival in Houston, Texas, after the event's deadly crowd surge. It saw 8 people dead and 8 people killed and dozens injured. Manuel Souza was among those who got trampled on. He is suing rapper and organizer Travis Scott, Live Nation Entertainment Company, and others involved in the festival, who he said consciously ignored the extreme risks of harm for concert goers. Scott has released a video statement about the event, saying he paused the show in times when he could see the violent situation unfolding.
Send out prayers to the ones that was lost last night. We're actually working right now to identify the families so we can help assist them through this tough time. I could just never imagine the severity of the situation. I'm honestly just devastated, and I'm gonna do everything I can to keep you guys updated.
Some attendees described the concert as traumatizing as they witnessed lifeless bodies being crushed while the music kept playing. Now back here at home and in sports, the San Miguel Beermen have made a surprising trade, taking Northport Batangue's Vic Manuel in exchange for their power forward, Arwin Santos. The veteran Manuel hasn't had the chance to play for Northport after joining the team only 3 days ago alongside Michael Calisan. Both were from Phoenix Fuel Masters. Meanwhile, San Miguel is saying goodbye to a longtime player. Santos has won 9 PBA championships with the Beermen. The PBA Commissioner's Office approved the deal today. In entertainment, a thrilling new K-drama creeps onto Netflix on the heels of the Halloween season. If you enjoy the worldwide horror sensation Train to Busan, you might want to take a look at the director's latest webtoon-turned-series. Hellbound features strange creatures who have come to bring humans down to hell, or so it seems. The show, directed by Yeon Sang-ho, starts streaming November 19th. Here's a sneak peek at the final trailer.
뭐가 인간을 참여하게 할까요?
And in the movies, a web-slinging hero is coming back for its latest installment. The newest poster clues us in on what to expect. It hints at the comeback of some familiar villains in Spider-Man and No Way Home, from Doc Ock to Green Goblin. But we might have to wait a bit longer to see them all in action. Set to arrive in Philippine theaters January 8, 2022, nearly a month after its global release on December 17 this year. It is 47 days before Christmas, and that is it for tonight. Join me again on News.ph at 7 p.m. I'm Pia Ontiveros for Newsnight, where we go above and beyond the headlines.
Many of you have probably experienced a sinus infection. It's one of the most common conditions. A sinus infection, also known as sinusitis, is the inflammation or swelling of the tissues lining your sinuses, the small air pockets behind your forehead, your nose, your cheekbones, and in between your eyes. It can develop after a cold, the flu, or even just an allergic reaction. But today, people might mistake sinusitis for COVID-19. The symptoms of the two are very similar, and from headaches to difficulty breathing and even loss of smell and taste. Here on MedTalk Health Talk, we'll discuss how to tell them apart and how to best avoid them altogether. I'm Dr. Freddy Gomez. This is CNN Philippines. Sinusitis and COVID-19 are two conditions that have very similar warning signs. Today, we'll help you tell the difference. We'd like to welcome our guests for today. With us is Dr. Paulo Catindig. He's an ENT head and neck surgeon and rhinologist from the Makati Medical Center. Also with us is Dr. Elmer Angus. He's a family medicine specialist and past department head of community and family medicine at Manila Doctors Hospital. Ngayon, bago natin pag-usapan ang pagkakaiba ng sinusitis at COVID-19, pag-usapan muna natin kung ano ba talaga ang sinusitis. Dr. Paulo, could you tell us more about what this is?
Sinusitis per se is the inflammation of the sinuses or lining of our paranasal sinuses. Basically, we have our maxillary, the one is located here in the front, in between our nose, that we call the ethmoids, the one behind our nose, our sphenoid, and the one at the topmost portion is our frontal sinuses. So if you have an inflammation of these areas, we call it collectively as your sinusitis. However, sinusitis per se is not really just the sinuses. Now we call it as rhinosinusitis because most of the time it's not only the sinuses that's got infected, even the internal lining of the nose has got inflamed. That's why it would come up with sinusitis as well.
Sinusitis or rhinosinusitis is actually a very common condition, and there are different types that can range from acute to actually chronic. Dr. Paulo, what are some of the types of sinusitis na pwedeng ma-experience ng mga tao?
Patient would have symptoms such as facial pains, nasal obstruction, anterior and posterior postnasal nasal drips, and patient would have reduced in smell and in pain. So usually these symptoms would last, depending if it is acute, less than 12 weeks, but if it is chronic, more than 12 weeks in duration.
Acute sinusitis, as mentioned by Dr. Paulo, has a short duration. It can last anywhere from around 2 to 4 weeks. Pero, Dr. Elmer, ano ba talaga ang ibig sabihin ng acute at bakit nangyayari itong klaseng condition?
Acute meaning between 1 to 2 weeks, no? Usually viral yan. And then when it is already more than 2 weeks, abot siya ng 4 weeks, bacterial na po yan. So subacute naman, after that, kung lalampas pa, it may come up to 3 months, no? And then pag lampas pa niyan, it will be a chronic already, usually more than 3 months na.
I'd like to focus for this episode on the acute rhinosinusitis because dito pwede magkaroon ng similar symptoms with that of COVID-19. Dr. Paulo, when it comes to acute rhinosinusitis, let's remind our viewers again kung ano ang pwede nilang maramdaman.
For acute rhinosinusitis, patient can have, again, nasal obstruction, facial pains, nasal discharge. Patient can also have loss of smell, decrease in sense of smell as well.
So let's talk a little bit more about some of the conditions that could develop into a sinus infection. But I'd like to talk about certain things. For that matter, a deviated nasal septum or ito yung pagkatabingi ng ilong, hindi siya diretso. Dr. Paulo, how can this contribute to someone having acute rhinosinusitis?
When we look at the patient's CT scans, some patients would complain of, again, nasal congestion. Some patients would not. But in reality, hindi naman talaga siya diretsong-diretso. There are some instances that your nasal septum can be really deviated. It's really the degree of the deviation that would cause the nasal obstruction, the symptoms of the patient. Kapag sobrang deviated, dun lang. Some patient would have some trauma. For example, pag karoon ng trauma, nabangga, yung iba biglang mababali either yung septum or magkakaroon ng nasal bone fracture. So the deviation can trigger bigla na lang, Dok, biglang nawalan ako ng pang-amoy.
Are nasal polyps the same as polyps found in other parts of the body? How can this contribute to rhinosinusitis?
So nasal polyps are inflammatory tissues that got engorged actually. There's really no specific reason until now on why these polyps would come, but most of the time it is correlated because of chronic inflammation. That's why we consider nasal polyp formation as a chronic problem as well.
Now, Dr. Elmer, kapag ang pasyente pumunta sa inyo at nagreklamo ng mga ganitong klaseng simptomas, are there any signs and symptoms that would make you immediately say that this is a case of rhinosinusitis as opposed to other possible diseases such as COVID-19?
There are symptoms that you can really pinpoint na yung rhinosinusitis mo ay hindi COVID, no? One of that is yung gastrointestinal symptoms like diarrhea, no? Wala namang diarrhea ang sinusitis. Aside from that, you are going to have body aches and pains, and especially kung prone na talaga siya sa COVID, no? Positive na. And then you will develop what we call shortness of breath or tawag namin SOB. And magkaroon ka na ng loss of smell or tastes.
Now, when we return, more telltale signs of sinusitis and how we can tell them apart from COVID-19 symptoms. Keep it here on MedTalk Health Talk. You're watching CNN Philippines. I'm Dr. Freddy Gomez and welcome back to MedTalk Health Talk, where your health comes first. Overlapping can make it hard to tell if you have COVID-19 or rhinosinusitis infection. Here on the program, we'll help you tell them apart. I'll go with Dr. Elmer on this one. Pinag-usapan natin yung mga simptomas that are shared between COVID-19 and rhinosinusitis. Let's review here in particular itong nasal congestion. Is this a common symptom with COVID-19 and rhinosinusitis?
Runny nose, or what we call the so-called congestion of the nose, common yan sa rhinosinusitis. Same time, meron din yan sa COVID-19.
A lot of people now are really worried, especially it's the pandemic, we have different variants. Any sort of symptom may make them think that it is already COVID-19. I'll go with Dr. Paulo on the next one. And it's quite common nowadays that people with COVID-19 say that they lose their smell, as well as humihina or nawawala yung panlasa nila. And this is also a shared trait with someone who is experiencing rhinosinusitis. But Dr. Paulo, can you help us distinguish how one would think of one disease as opposed to the other?
For patients with sinusitis, more likely patients with chronic rhinosinusitis, so patient even before the advent of COVID-19, even pre-pandemic, patient would always complain of, Doc, lagi naman akong sinisipon eh. Tapos the patient would tell us, Doc, paulit-ulit, tas laging nawawala yung pangamoy ko, babalik, nawawala, bumabalik. No? So that's one category that clinically, more likely, the patient had chronic sinusitis even before. Now, if it is a new onset, that the patient would have fever, cough, runny nose, sore throat, aside and a new onset of anosmia or nagwala ng pangamoy and panglasa, then probably that's the time we investigate.
Now, Dr. Elmer, let's remind our viewers again some of the symptoms ng COVID-19 na nakikita lang or very likely na nasa COVID-19 lamang.
There are symptoms that are found in COVID-19, no? Like this is not associated with sinusitis. Yung shortness of breath, yung body aches and pains, sa COVID yan. And of course, meron loss of smell and taste.
Earlier you mentioned the symptom of facial pain that is very characteristic of someone with rhinosinusitis. Now, can someone who is experiencing rhinosinusitis also feel symptoms that of the flu, body aches and pains, the very generalized feelings of the flu that can make them think twice whether this is just a case of rhinosinusitis or if this is warranted to be tested for COVID-19?
So aside from the facial pains, the patient would have anosmia and the patient would develop cough, sore throat, then more likely I would link more on mag-isip ako na more likely baka COVID-19 ito, no? Rather than just acute sinusitis. But if the patient would just complain of facial pains alone, then runny nose, then more likely it can be just acute sinusitis.
Now, like any infection, sinusitis can also contribute to a weakened immune system. And with COVID-19 still around, it's vital to keep healthy as well as protected. Dr. Elmer, can rhinosinusitis or sinusitis evolve into COVID-19?
I have sinusitis at the same time, nagkaroon ako ng COVID, no? But first, you have to think of the symptoms kung kailan sila first nag-appear, no? You are going to have severe symptoms kung magkaroon ka ng COVID, like 20% of them will have severe symptoms, whereas the sinusitis infection, usually kung viral ang infection or cause noon, it will just go away. And complications will only sit in kung late na or usually bacterial na yung mga causes nila.
Okay.
So, yun ang mga other ways to differentiate sinus infection and COVID-19.
Now, Dr. Paolo, I'd like to ask, for those diagnosed cases naman of allergic rhinitis, sanay na sila with the symptoms of allergic rhinitis, but is it possible that they could have very mild symptoms of COVID-19 already, that they think that they are just having another bout of allergic rhinitis?
Currently, there are patients who are asymptomatic or with just mild symptoms that can be really na masasabi na, oh, pwede palang COVID-19. So we just stick to the, again, history, background of the patient, like what you've mentioned, history of exposure to COVID-19 patients before or in the household. At the same time, another is an important history of patients who had the same characteristic of symptoms within the household.
Dr. Elmer, my question for you is, when do we need to visit a doctor or hospital for proper testing?
In case you have COVID-19, you have to go for COVID tests, no, right away, to be sure if the symptoms are due to COVID and not for other illnesses. Then stay at home while you are waiting for the release of the tests.
If you're feeling symptoms after a short break, we want to be your partner for a lifetime of good health here on MedTalk Health Talk. Stay with us on CNN Philippines. I'm Dr. Freddy Gomez and glad to have you back on MedTalk Health Talk. While sinusitis and COVID-19 have very similar symptoms, treatment for each is also very different. Today we'll discuss what to do if you think you have either condition. Now, we've mentioned that symptoms of sinusitis usually go away on their own, and 70% of people actually recover from rhinosinusitis without the use of prescription medications. But if you have sinusitis and your symptoms are disrupting your day-to-day, there are some home remedies that can help. Dr. Paolo, can you give some of your tried and true home remedies to our viewers?
Sinusitis, and most of the time it's viral. So you can buy actually your over-the-counter nasal decongestants at times. No? It's also helpful as well. Then increase your immune system, like taking your vitamins regularly. It's also an important factor also.
And make sure to stay well hydrated, rest, and drink a good bowl of soup. These natural remedies can help your body fight the infection. But when your sinusitis is caused by a bacterial infection, antibiotics is usually recommended to relieve some of the symptoms faster. Dr. Paolo, when it comes to antibiotic use, when is this needed? How is this used? And can our viewers self-medicate on their own?
Your ENT doctor might request for a nasal endoscopy, or they would check the inside of your nose. So aside from the usual, the typical symptoms of facial pains and discharge, your doctor wanted to check the patency of your osteomeatus or your meatus, and then check if there is pus running down on it. So kung may nana na lumalabas na doon sa loob ng ilong, more likely this is bacterial in nature. That's why we start on patients on antibiotics already. I would really not advise patients on the early phase of their disease to start agad ng antibiotics. No? So if you had symptoms of more than a week and the pain is there and you would see yellowish discoloration of your discharge, then probably that's the time you go and seek to your nearest health clinician and have it checked.
Now, Dr. Paolo, pwede bang umabot sa punto na surgical na ang treatment na kailangan for rhinosinusitis?
So for chronic cases of sinusitis and patients who had nasal septal deviation, nasal polyps, and for kids with chronic rhinosinusitis, you usually advise for surgery already, like what we call the functional endoscopic sinus surgery. And we remove the polyps or the obstruction that causes the inflammation of the sinuses. Then during the surgery, we clean already the sinus areas.
Now, going back to COVID-19, there are many disputed claims on how to treat it, from antiviral medicines to active vaccines. But we can't stress enough that testing for the virus and consulting your doctor are the most important first steps before treatment. Now, Dr. Elmer, can you walk us through what we need to do if we suspect that we have COVID-19?
One, you can do the test for COVID. Number two, while waiting for that, you quarantine yourself. No? Ito kasi tinatawag nating patient focus, no? Na management. No? So we have to let him be quarantined and then wear masks, no? As well as you have to stay 6 feet away from other persons, the so-called social distancing natin.
Now, Dr. Paolo, itong mga home testing kits, I know you're an advocate of the PCR, of course, is the gold standard, but these home testing kits, what's your advice to the viewers? Is this something that they should rely on?
Well, actually, there is some guidelines already released by the Department of Health regarding to this rapid antigen test kits. And I think they released 3 accredited rapid antigen testing kits that is readily available for use. So I think this should be used with just prudence, especially for clinicians who had for us ENTs most especially, who's been seeing patients regularly with nasal complaints. I think it's an added protection for us doctors as well to test our patients who had these symptoms in our clinics.
Dr. Paolo, can you share with us why and how vaccines can help?
So for these vaccines, again, for those patients that doesn't have the infection, hindi pa nagkakaroon ng infection, our goal is for us to be inoculated with the virus, no, yung dead virus na tinatawag natin. So for us to develop the antibody against this virus.
While COVID-19 is still very much around, protect yourself and your loved ones from it, as well as sinusitis and many other diseases by following the standard safety protocols. Wash your hands frequently, wear a mask, and practice proper social distancing. Those are the basic ones, but they are still very important. I'd like to thank ENT head and neck specialist and rhinologist Dr. Paolo Catindig and family medicine specialist Dr. Elmer Angus for being with us on today's episode. We hope our conversation was very helpful to our viewers. Choose well and choose to be healthy. I'm Dr. Freddy Gomez, and we'll see you again next time. Stay safe, everyone.